Since 2023 is coming to an end, I figured it would be fun to make a video of my top 10 airbrush recommendations for the new year. Now, in my opinion, these airbrushes are the best of the best, and I'd be happy to have any one of these as my only airbrush. And of course, this video is subjective. It's just my opinion, and I expect others watching this video to have different opinions, which I think is great. So before I start with number 10, I'd love to hear your opinion on which airbrush you'd recommend, or better yet, what would be your list of your top 3 or top 5 airbrushes of all time. So leave those down below in the comments section, because I really look forward to reading them, and I think it'll help other people out as well. And just a quick note, I bought every single one of these with my own money. I love airbrushes. I absolutely love painting with them. They're far and away my favorite painting tools, and I'm very grateful for being able to do it. But the point is that this video is completely independent. There's no sponsors, no one's paying me, no brand sent me any of these airbrushes. They're just the ones that I think are the best in the world and the ones I'd recommend to anybody. Airbrush number 10 is a legendary airbrush. This is the Harder & Steenbeck Infinity. Now, I expect a fair amount of people to say that this is the number 1 airbrush in the world, and a lot of people love it because it's a phenomenal airbrush. There's no question about that. In my opinion, it's one of the best airbrushes ever made, but on my list, it sits at the number 10 spot. What makes it so special is Harder & Steenbeck's attention to detail. No other brand on this list builds an airbrush to the level that Harder & Steenbeck does. And if you own one of these, you'll know what I'm talking about. Iwata airbrushes are very close, but Harder & Steenbeck just has a little bit nicer fit and finish to their airbrushes and a slightly nicer polish to the finished product. This Infinity is a CR Plus, which has a triple chrome coating. I have this model equipped with a 0.15mm needle and nozzle, which is the smallest airbrush nozzle size that you can get from any brand. Harder & Steenbeck was one of the first brands that I'm aware of that has a removable paint cup. On this version, the CR Plus, I have on the mini cup, which is great just to add a few drops of paint in. And on my original Infinity, which is plated in nickel rather than chrome, I have a chrome cup on it, and you could clearly see the difference in the color here between the nickel plating of the airbrush and the chrome coating of the cup. Besides this removable paint cup, you could also swap out the nozzle with different sizes. Like I said, I have the 0.15 in here, but you could switch it out with a 0.2, a 0.4, or a 0.6 along with the corresponding needle. And these needles and nozzles are universal across the Harder & Steenbeck line, which is awesome, but also means that you could buy a cheaper Harder & Steenbeck, equip it with a 0.15mm needle and nozzle, and get it to spray exactly like the Infinity. So even though the Infinity is a great airbrush, you can get the exact same performance with a cheaper airbrush like the Ultra, which you could buy for like 99 bucks. About a year ago, when I was painting this landscape, I switched over to the Infinity with the new version 2 0.15 needle. And I was painting with the Infinity here, painting in a few of the reflections within the water. The airbrush spray is amazing. It always atomizes the paint beautifully. And because of that small nozzle, it has a very acute spray angle. So you could paint some incredible detail with this airbrush. I've always enjoyed painting with the Infinity. The trigger sits a little bit farther back, so it kind of feels different than some other detail airbrushes, but to me it feels very comfortable. But the one thing that I dislike about the Infinity is the trigger response. What I'm doing here is pulling back on the airbrush trigger to see how far I have to pull back in order to get paint. I'm always holding down for air. The only way I'm starting and stopping the paint is pulling back on the trigger and pressing it forward again. And to me, the Infinity's trigger is just not that responsive. Now, I'm very picky with the trigger response. I want it to spray instantly. If I nudge back the smallest amount, I want to get paint. And with the Infinity, I just don't get that. There's always a very small delay before it starts to spray paint, and that delay kind of feels inconsistent. It's not the same at every point. And I'm talking about this airbrush right out of the box without any sort of modifications to it. The trigger response does feel very soft and very comfortable. I just wish it was a bit more consistent. Painting fine lines, this airbrush is incredible. I can paint a line here which is thinner than a human hair. But you can do this with pretty much any airbrush as long as you hold it close to the surface, and I have a whole video explaining how to do that. And finally, for the last test, I'm just going to write out a few letters. I'll write out the word airbrush here, and then I'll do the same thing painting it in with the airbrush, starting and stopping. This is actually surprisingly difficult to do with any airbrush, and it's a very good test of a trigger response rate. Writing in cursive where you're continually spraying paint is very easy to do. That should be the basic of any airbrush. But starting and stopping is difficult because it's showing that trigger response. And again, just like I said before, it's not really bad here, but it's not great. So besides that, I still think that the Infinity is a phenomenal airbrush, one that I'm very happy to own. Few companies make an airbrush as nicely as Harder and Steenbeck, so if I ever lost one of these, I'd have to replace it and buy a new one immediately. It's a bit expensive. It goes for around $250 to $290 US depending on what you're getting in the kit. But the Harder and Steenbeck Infinity is an outstanding airbrush, and for me, it sits at number 10 of the best airbrushes to buy. Number 9 is without a doubt one of my favorite airbrushes ever made. This of course is the Badger Sotar 2020. This airbrush, along with another one that you'll see later on in this video, made me fall in love with the airbrush as a painting tool. So let's start with what I love about it before talking about what I don't. And the first thing is the way that it feels in the hand. It's incredibly comfortable. It almost feels like you're drawing with a technical pencil. It's a short airbrush and the trigger is very close to the nozzle, so you always feel like you're painting very close to the surface that you're working on. It truly feels like a precision drafting tool, and it's just such a great airbrush to paint with. The rear handle design is my favorite from any airbrush. You're able to remove the needle while that handle is still connected. To some people this may not seem important, but to me it's a very big deal. I always want quick access to my airbrush needle. I like to set the needle into the nozzle properly before each painting session, and I like to remove it when flushing out colors. It's the reason that when I'm painting with an airbrush, I never have the rear handle on, because to me it just gets in the way. But now with the Sotar 2020, I could leave that rear handle on and always have access to my needle. To me, it feels like the Sotar 2020 was designed by someone who was painting with an airbrush for a long time. And every time I use it, I'm reminded of why I love this airbrush so much. The trigger feel and response rate is outstanding, and it's a true competitor to Iwata airbrushes. Regarding response rate, no airbrush is ever going to be perfect. You're spraying paint and pigments through a tiny nozzle, so naturally you're going to get some clogs here and there. But the Sotar 2020 is absolutely one of the best. When I pull back a small amount, I'm always getting the same amount of paint. And the start and stop point when painting something like letters is excellent. As I said, to me, it's one of the only airbrushes that feels like a drawing tool. And what I mean by that is the control is just so precise and always doing what you want it to. The model I have is equipped with a 0.2mm needle and nozzle, so it makes it a true detail airbrush. And when painting fine lines, I can paint a hairline with this one, just like I can with the Infinity. When I was painting this Rembrandt copy on this channel, I was using the Sotar 2020 for a good amount of it. And with the hundreds, probably thousands of hours that I painted with this airbrush over the years, I didn't have any issue at all here. It was doing exactly what I wanted, which to me is everything in an airbrush. And so far, I've only talked about what I love about this airbrush. The one thing that I don't love is the build quality of it. When you compare the Sotar 2020 to the 9 other airbrushes in this top 10 video, I would say that unfortunately it's the lowest build quality of any of them. The finishing and the fit and finish are not good compared to what you're seeing from other airbrushes. The finishing inside the cup is sloppy, it looks messy in there, and it's unpolished, and the internal parts look and feel kind of cheap to me. They're not bad, but just compared to everything else in this review, they're not up there with the others. I still love the Sotar 2020. I own a bunch of them, and with every single one, I constantly need to add beeswax on the threads of the nozzle cap because it tends to always leak air. It's a very finicky airbrush. It's difficult to take apart, clean, and maintain, but if you get good at doing that, it's just an amazing airbrush to paint with. I've noticed over the last year that this airbrush is becoming difficult to buy. I see it out of stock in a lot of places, and the price tends to be going up. But I am still very hopeful that the supply and the prices get better because I love Badger airbrushes, and I'd love to see them back where they once were. And honestly, the Sotar 2020 could be my number 1 airbrush of all time. But again, the quality of the manufacturing holds it back. But in my opinion, the Sotar 2020 is the gold standard of how an airbrush should perform. And at the end of the day, that's what matters the most. If you're thinking about buying one of these, I 100% recommend it. It's one that's never going to let you down. So that's the Sotar 2020 at the number 9 spot. Number 8 to me is the best looking airbrush on this list. This airbrush is kind of like the twin brother to the Infinity. It's the Harder and Steenbeck Evolution. And the reason that I say twin is because this one and the Infinity are very similar airbrushes. It might not look like it because there's definitely some design changes between the two, but they spray exactly the same because the internals are the same. The nozzle cap on the Evolution is different from the Infinity, but the nozzle and needle are exactly the same. If you buy the solo version with the nickel plating, you can get it for $100 less than the Infinity, and it's usually sold for around $140 to $150 US. And I just personally love the way that the nickel coating looks. It's got this warmer hue over a chrome coating, and it's just as strong and durable. A few things about nickel though is that some people are allergic to it, so you want to make sure that you know that before you buy this one. Another thing about nickel is that it tends to tarnish over time and the airbrush will build up a patina of where your hands are on it. I actually kind of like this. I think it's a cool feature of nickel, but if you don't like that or you have an allergy to nickel, they also make the same airbrush in a chrome coating. Just like the Infinity, the build of the Evolution is as good as it gets. It's just outstanding workmanship and manufacturing. And to be honest, I'm not really sure how Harder and Steenbeck does it and keeps the prices pretty low because they're just such impressive airbrushes to get for around $200 US. And again, you could buy this Evolution for well under that, around $140, $150. I prefer the air cap on the Evolution to the Infinity because I notice I get a slightly lower airspeed, and also I find the needle cap a lot easier to take on and off because it's just a screw on. When I'm painting with the Evolution, it feels exactly like the Infinity, and again, I just don't think that the trigger response is all that good because there's always just a bit of a delay before it starts to spray that paint. Like I said in the Infinity, I'm picky about this. I want the airbrush to start spraying instantly, and sometimes this one feels like it starts spraying 1/10 of a millimeter back or 1/4 of a millimeter back, but not at the same point. And I know that that doesn't sound like much, but it makes the airbrush feel inconsistent, and it just makes it a real challenge to use for precision work. I know that on the DreadFX YouTube channel, he has a little hack where you could put a washer or two or an O-ring basically in the back to pick up some of the slack. He's got a great YouTube channel over there. I tried it out myself and it definitely helps a lot. But when you buy a precision instrument like an airbrush, you shouldn't need to have to add a modification to it. But I will say that it helps a lot with the trigger response. Besides starting spraying the paint, this airbrush spray is incredible. It's one of the best out there. And on this one, I have the 0.2 millimeter needle and nozzle rather than the 0.15. Compared to the 0.15, these spray pretty much identically. It sprays extremely fine detail and super thin lines. As you can see here, I can easily paint a line about as thick as a human hair. But the only way to really know how an airbrush performs is to use it in practice. So as I was painting this portrait in the early stages here, I switched over to the Evolution from my Micron. And the whole time I'm painting with this, I loved it. But it's just like I said before, I wish that trigger response was a bit better. I will say that just like the Infinity, the trigger does feel incredibly comfortable. It's very soft. You sit a little bit farther back on the airbrush, and I love painting with it. And I don't think that you could ever go wrong buying a Harder and Steenbeck. Beautiful airbrushes that spray amazing. And on this Evolution, you can switch out the needle and nozzle to some wider ones if you want to spray some thicker paint. You can move up to the 0.4 or the 0.6. So that's the Harder and Steenbeck Evolution, an awesome airbrush, and I think the prettiest looking one on this list. Number 7 deserves every single bit of attention and praise that it's been getting over the past few years. This airbrush is the Creos PS289. Everyone seems to love this airbrush. I love this airbrush, and if you buy it, I bet you're going to love it too, because there's a lot to love on this one. First of all, the build quality of it is exceptional. It might not be up there with Harder and Steenbeck, but it's pretty close, very similar to Iwata airbrushes. This is the first airbrush on this list that has almost no negatives in my opinion. It's almost a perfect airbrush and it comes in at an amazing price point. It has a nearly flawless chrome finish and the internal parts and manufacturing are absolute precision. It has a Mac valve underneath the front cup and I know that some people really love to have these on their airbrushes. My opinion though is that I wish it didn't because it's just a chunk of metal there that gets in the way and it's something that I never use. So I wish there was an option for the 289 without the Mac valve because I'd probably pay even a bit more money to have one without it. But it's an extra feature on the airbrush and it works very, very well. The finishing inside the airbrush is just as good as everything on the outside. I mean, just look inside this cup. It's absolutely flawless. The bottom of the cup also comes down to a very nice taper, so the paint can't collect or build up on the sides of it. It gets forced right down into the nozzle. The rear handle is nice and simple and it's chunky. It's got some weight to it. And the internals here are very similar to Iwata airbrushes, super easy to break down and clean. The trigger tension is one of the softest on the market. It's almost a bit too soft for my liking, even when I tighten it down all the way, but it just feels very well made. I do wish that there was some more tension on it because I'm kind of heavy-handed with an airbrush, but it was clearly designed to be this soft and I think most people are going to love it. The only negative that I have about this airbrush is the air piston air valve assembly at the bottom of it. On most airbrushes, this part comes straight down at a 90-degree angle to the body, but on the 289 it comes down at an angle here, like toward the back of your hand. And when I'm painting with this airbrush with the standard grip that you're seeing here, The airbrush almost feels like it's tilting down on me. I'm not quite sure why they chose to design it this way, because to me it feels pretty uncomfortable. It almost feels like you're painting with a paintbrush that has a crooked handle on it, so it just feels a bit weird. But I've been airbrushing for a long time and I'm used to the other designs, so it might just be a personal preference thing. I'm just used to the other ones. I think that if you start out with this one, you'll probably get used to it. But honestly, I can't really call this a negative because it's a design choice. They chose to make it like this and it just doesn't suit my preference, but you may love it. If you want a nearly perfect and instantaneous trigger response, the 289 is an airbrush you need to pay attention to. The trigger response on this one is outstanding. You pull back on the trigger, just nudge it back a small amount, and you get paint at the same point every single time. This is exactly what I want to see from any airbrush designer or manufacturer when it comes to trigger response. And the details of the line and spray pattern are perfect. On all of these tests, I have the paint over-reduced about 1:1 with distilled water and paint. And I'm spraying at 25 psi, so you may see some of the paint running. That's normal when you're spraying with over-reduced paint. In every one of these tests, I'm using Createx Illustration Sepia, which I ran through a strainer to make sure that no dried paint got into it. And again, I reduced it about 1:1 with distilled water. I usually don't reduce a paint this far, but I did for these tests because I wanted it to be like a perfect case scenario. This is a very good paint, very easy to spray through any airbrush. That way it just keeps all these tests consistent and fair. Painting a fine line with the 289 is a breeze, no surprise here. You could paint just as thin as a hairline, just like the other airbrushes. And a while back, while I was painting this picture, which has multiple figures in it in the rain, I switched over to the 289 to use on the woman on the left here to paint in some of the mouth and some of the skin textures. And it performed exactly the way I wanted it to. The detail was spot on. The control was excellent. It's really just all around a great airbrush. And one of the best things about this one is that you could pick this up right now on Amazon for around 80 to 90 US dollars. And I'm sure if you look around, you'll find a great price. When I ordered it from Amazon, it was actually shipped from Japan. It came in about a week, but I think I paid around 83, 84 US dollars for it. And at that price, it's an absolute steal. So that's the Mr. Hobby Creos PS289 at the 7 spot. At number 6, we have the first of my favorite airbrush brand of all time, Iwata. This model is the Iwata High Performance Plus, and the one I have here is the HPB. I think that Iwata, without question, is the best manufacturer of airbrushes on the planet. I've never owned an Iwata airbrush that I didn't love, and this one's no different. This HPB Plus has a 0.2mm needle and nozzle, which makes this one a true detail airbrush, but it's not limited to that. You could do pretty much anything with this one. This airbrush sits between the Iwata Eclipse and the Iwata Micron. And one thing that's so special about Iwata is that every airbrush line that they make is different from other lines. What I mean by that is that they don't cut corners by designing a single nozzle and a single head assembly and then just making different sizes of it. With Iwata, they literally design a different nozzle and head assembly for each airbrush. Like the Micron is completely different from the HPB, and both are very different from the Eclipse. In the hand, when painting, this airbrush feels perfect to me. The trigger is just right. It could be softer or tighter depending on how you set that spring tension, and I could paint with this one all day long without getting fatigued or frustrated that something's not working correctly in the airbrush. Iwatas just always perform and spray well because their quality control and manufacturing is as good as it gets. The internals on the HPB are also perfect. It's that same Iwata standard that you'll see across every one they make, and it's one of the reasons why so many new airbrush brands today are copying Iwata. Their airbrushes are timeless and they're designed to last your entire life. Now, I told myself for each one of these top 10 airbrushes, I'd find something good and something bad about each one. And just like the Creos that came before it, this one's really difficult to find any fault. One thing is that the prices are going to be a bit higher on Iwata airbrushes. This one usually goes around for 200 US dollars, but if you look around for some deals, you could usually pick this one up for around 150 to 170 US dollars. For this model, I think that's worth every penny. I think that's a great price because when you buy an airbrush like this, you don't need to upgrade. That's it. You know, that could be your one airbrush for the rest of your life. And one other thing that some people aren't crazy about is that this one has a screw-in nozzle. That's kind of the old school design where you need a special tool to remove the nozzle. And if you get a clog in there, it makes it a real challenge to take apart and clean. Very, very easy to break. But as long as some dried paint doesn't make its way into your airbrush, you'll never need to remove that nozzle. And the thing about this nozzle design is one of the reasons that Iwata airbrushes spray and perform so well. So there's no way that I can really call this a con about the airbrush because it's one of the factors that makes it so great. You just need to be aware that if you're cleaning the nozzle, it's going to be a little bit more difficult than other Iwatas like the Eclipse. The chrome coating and the inside of the cup are also perfectly made, and the bottom of the cup also has a nice taper to direct that paint toward the nozzle. Just like the last airbrush on this list, the trigger response on this one is as good as it gets. Absolutely perfect performance. I pull back the tiniest amount. You can see my trigger finger, it's barely even going back, and I'm getting paint at that same point. So very well done. And when I'm testing any airbrush, this is a perfect example right here of what I want to see. The trigger response is just so accurate on this airbrush that writing with it almost feels like you're writing with a pen. There's just zero problem starting and stopping the paint, and of course I'm spraying air the entire time, and the lines here are clean and sharp. I don't think that I've ever used an Iwata airbrush that didn't spray like this. They all just have perfect control. So if trigger response is very important to you like it is to me, Iwata airbrushes are one of the best to pick up. And if you're looking to paint easy, fine lines and detail work, this airbrush is perfect for that. When I was working on this portrait, I used the HPB quite a bit and absolutely loved it. For almost every portrait, I'm using my Micron for most of the work because that's my favorite detail airbrush. And even though this one has a 0.2 millimeter needle and nozzle, and the Micron has a 0.18, I will say that this one sprays and feels a lot closer to the Iwata Eclipse rather than it does to the Micron. And I love the Iwata Eclipse. You'll see later that it's definitely one of my favorite airbrushes, but it just goes to show how important the nozzle design is because like I said, the nozzle designs on Iwata airbrushes are all different from different lines. And just because an airbrush's nozzle has a small diameter doesn't mean that it's a true detail airbrush or will spray like one. And this one just falls in that perfect middle ground. You can get close, spray some great detail, some really tight lines, but you can also back up like you can with an Eclipse and spray some wider patterns. So there's not much more to say about this one. It's just all around an amazing airbrush and one that I'm very happy to own. If you ever see a deal or see the HPB Plus on sale, pick it up because it's one that you're not going to regret buying. So with that one done, we're moving into the top 5, and number 5 is the new Harder & Steenbeck Ultra. The Ultra 2024 was designed with new painters in mind, and it's got a bunch of features to it that make it such a cool airbrush. This one was clearly designed and marketed toward modelers and miniature painters. Now that's not what I do, but I know that a lot of model and miniature painters watch this channel, and I love having you guys here because it's always fun to chat with you in the comments about different airbrushes. And I really admire the extreme attention to detail in your work and have nothing but respect for it. But even though the Ultra 2024 is designed and marketed toward beginner modelers and miniature painters, this airbrush is for anyone. This is just a normal updated airbrush that has a lot of cool new features to it. And if you do paint minis or models, you're going to love this one because the features in it are really made for you. Starting with the build quality and the manufacturing of the airbrush, it's exactly what I expected from Harder & Steenbeck. It's an absolutely perfect, flawless finish to it, zero imperfections across the whole airbrush. Everything is precisely machined and all the parts fit together so well. And like the Infinity CR Plus, this one actually comes standard with that chrome coating. Now, as I said in the Evolution review, I am a huge fan of their nickel-coated airbrushes. But again, a lot of people prefer chrome and some people have that allergy to nickel. Chrome is strong, it looks great, and it's going to last a lifetime. For 2024, they also updated the trigger to a much larger one, and I think this is Harder & Steenbeck's best trigger. It's just very wide on the top, it has some ridges in it, and it gives you a good amount of grip. Another nice feature about this for beginners is that you can pull it back until you press down on it, and it's very important to paint with an airbrush with good technique. You always want to start spraying air first before you pull back on the trigger to spray paint, and the same thing goes in reverse. You want to push the trigger all the way forward so it stops spraying paint before you release the air. And I imagine for beginners that this could be very helpful. Painting with a good trigger technique is so important to painting well with an airbrush, and I think that this Ultra will help new painters start down the right path. And this other main feature here is this ring right behind the trigger. It's kind of like a needle limiter or a trigger stop that you'll see on the rear handle of an airbrush, but this one works differently. This one gives you preset distances to pull back on your trigger, so prime, base, a bunch of different settings on it. And one of the difficult things for new painters is trying to figure out how far back you have to pull that trigger. And this design takes the guessing out of it, and it will help you build up some good muscle memory. And you could set this to the open position and spray it just like a normal airbrush. You can also remove this ring from the airbrush and paint with it without it. It's really up to you. And the internal parts here are just so nicely made and polished. You'll know that when you're painting with this one or taking it apart to clean, that it's a real premium airbrush. There's not a single part in this Ultra that feels cheap to me. It doesn't seem like any corners were cut. And what really surprised me is the price of this one. They're selling this for $99 US. At $100, I think that this one is a great deal, and it might just be the perfect airbrush for new painters. And of course, that's what it was designed for, but they kept the quality just as high as every other Harder & Steenbeck airbrush, and they made the price low. So obviously I'm very impressed with this one. That's why it sits at the number 5 spot. I was actually a big fan of the older Ultra. I picked it up not that long ago and I really liked it, and that one was pretty cheap too. But this one just steps it up. And like I said, I want to find something I like and don't for each one of these airbrushes, and the one thing that I'm not crazy about is this cup. It's very large and close to the trigger, so my finger just feels really cramped in there. I always keep my finger pretty far up on the airbrush trigger, and to me when the cup's on here, it just feels too uncomfortable. But Harder & Steenbeck must have thought that through, because this cup is removable just like the last Ultra. It's a different cup though, because the opening here is wider, and what's nice about a wider opening is that this actually holds a fair amount of paint. So when I was painting with this airbrush, I was using it like this without the cup. When you're painting with an airbrush using transparent paints, you're really not using that much paint. I'm only using a few drops at a time. And this opening here holds about 4 drops of paint, so it works great for me. And when painting without the cup, it's actually better than a side feed airbrush. And I really like side feeds because it gives you a lot of room for your trigger finger. And because this one doesn't need a side cup, it feels a lot more balanced and comfortable in the hand. And if you want more paint, you could use that large cup. It's still perfectly usable. I just find it a bit uncomfortable. Since the cup's removable, I do hope that they sell some smaller ones, some medium-sized cups in the future. I'd love to pick one of those up. I'm not sure if they plan on that, but in my experience, Harder & Steenbeck has always been good at giving you options. It's not necessary, but it would be nice to have those options in the future. But the way it comes in the box, I'm very happy with this. And besides the amazing build quality and the cool features for new painters, what really surprised me about this one is how it sprays paint. The trigger response on this one is excellent. I'm so used to that delay in my other Harder & Steenbeck airbrushes that this one kind of caught me by surprise. As I'm testing the trigger response rate, it's spraying paint at the same point every time. I've only been painting with this one for about a week, but so far I'm very impressed. It feels very consistent. Is it up there with Iwata or Badger? I'm not quite sure yet, but it seems to be pretty close. The trigger also has a good amount of tension to it, which is something that I absolutely love. I'm not sure if everyone else does, that might just be my preference, but it just felt so comfortable for me to paint with. Regarding control and trigger response, this is the best Harder & Steenbeck that I've used so far. It's really excellent. Even when I'm spraying letters like this, I had no problems with it. And even though this one comes with a larger needle and nozzle size at 0.4, I could still paint the same ultra thin line, just like every other airbrush in this video, about the width of a human hair. And again, I do have a video showing that any airbrush could spray a fine line. It's just about holding it close to the surface. Just recently I was finishing up this seascape painting, and for some of the rocks on the left side I switched over to the Ultra to see how it worked. And it was spraying great, but more importantly the control was there, which to me is everything. This is the only airbrush in this video that I don't have a full review of, but I'll get to that in a few weeks. But so far I've just been very happy painting with this one. There's also a lot more interesting things about this airbrush that I'll talk about in the full review. So that's my number 5, a really cool airbrush by Harder & Steenbeck, the 2024 Ultra. Number 4 is an airbrush that doesn't get enough attention. This airbrush is the Iwata Revolution. It's one of Iwata's cheapest airbrushes, but it sprays like one of their best. It has a larger nozzle size at 0.5 millimeters, but don't let that fool you in thinking that it can't spray detail, because this airbrush can spray detail just as well as pretty much every other airbrush in this video. The nozzle design on this one makes it one of the most versatile airbrushes on this list. Not only can you do everything with it, but you could do it all really well. You could spray thicker paint right out of the bottle. It has no issues with, a heavier white paint. And if you reduce that paint, drop the PSI, this thing is outstanding at spraying detail work. The Iwata Revolution usually goes for around $100 to $120 US. But over the last few months, the price on this one dropped. I've seen it a lot on Amazon from $80 to $90. Just like every other Iwata, the finishing on this one is perfect. It has a very tough chrome coating. The inside of the cup is nicely polished, and it has that standard taper that I talked about before, where it directs the paint right toward the nozzle. When you look at this airbrush, it almost looks boring. It doesn't have any of the extra features that make an airbrush more enticing, especially for new painters. There's no MAC valve, it doesn't have a removable cup, the rear handle doesn't have a needle limiter or a cutout, and it just goes to show that you don't need all those features to have a perfect airbrush, because this one is as close to perfect as you can get. I know some people have asked me what's the best airbrush to buy for around $100 US, and without question it's the Iwata Revolution. If you could find this for $80 to $90 US, I think it's the best deal that you can get today. And this is one of those airbrushes that you never need to upgrade from. If you want one really good airbrush that'll last the rest of your life and you don't want to spend too much, this is it. I really want to try to find one negative thing or flaw about this airbrush, but there's really nothing. It's just that good. It does have that old screw-in nozzle design, but as I said before, that's also what makes it spray so well. The nozzle and head assembly design are just that good. My favorite airbrush of all time is in the #1 spot, but this one is a direct competitor and paints just as well. And if this was the only airbrush that I had to use for the rest of my life, I'd be very happy with it. And even if I disregard the great pricing, let's say that this one was double the price, $160, maybe to $200 US, I still think that it would be an excellent deal and I'd be very happy with the purchase. The trigger response rate is absolutely perfect here. This is as good as you could possibly get. As I'm spraying these small dots, the paint's coming out at the same point every time, and just look at my trigger finger, it's barely even moving. All I do is just apply a bit of pressure backwards and I get paint. So even though the nozzle here is 0.5, this is still a precision painting instrument. When you want detail and smaller lines, it's all about holding it close to the surface. When I'm painting letters, starting and stopping the paint over and over, this airbrush is perfect. And like the last Iwata on this list, the HPB, and pretty much all Iwatas, it really feels like you're almost drawing with a pen or a pencil. I mean, it's just that precise. But with that larger nozzle size, the Revolution wants to put out a good amount of paint. If you pull a bit too far back on the trigger, it's going to spray a lot more paint than a detail airbrush or an Eclipse. So even though I can paint fine lines with this one by holding it close to the surface, I need to be very careful with the trigger so that I don't pull too far back on it. And even though the Revolution is marketed as an airbrush that's meant for wider spray applications, I can do everything with this airbrush because that trigger control is so good. And that's why trigger control is one of the most important parts of an airbrush. It doesn't matter what the nozzle size is, whether it's 0.2, 0.5, if the trigger control is there, you can do what you want. But with that said, a smaller nozzle size is always going to be geared more toward detail just because the airbrush is going to put out less paint. And a larger nozzle size is geared toward wider spray applications and thicker paint. When I was painting this portrait, the hand here is a bit larger, so I switched over to the Revolution. And it was just the perfect airbrush for this application. I was able to paint all the details, all the wrinkles I needed. And then when I needed to back up and spray a transparent glaze over this whole area, this airbrush did such an amazing job because of that wider spray pattern. So that's the Iwata Revolution at the #4 spot. I'm running out of adjectives to explain how good this airbrush is, but it's just a perfect airbrush with flawless performance and one that you really need to check out. Moving along to the top 3. Number 3 is the Creos PS771, the only airbrush that can give the Iwata Micron a run for its money. Creos airbrushes by Mr. Hobby might be the only brand that can equally compete with Iwata, because not only are they skillfully designed and manufactured, they spray just as well. I've heard a lot of people say that they are manufactured in the same factory as Iwata airbrushes, but I'm pretty sure that that's just a rumor going around. It could be true, but I haven't heard any official word, so to me it's just a rumor. Regardless of where they're manufactured, they're built exceptionally well. Just like Iwata's, these are a Japanese airbrush manufactured in Japan. And what makes the PS771 so special is the nozzle assembly and head design. This is essentially a clone of the Iwata Micron, and it has a 0.18mm nozzle. But it's not just that small nozzle that makes it spray so well, it's the engineering of this head system. This head design goes back to Olympus airbrushes, and up until now, the only brand that manufactured it was Iwata with the Micron. That is, of course, until this PS770 and 771 came along. The build quality of this one is phenomenal. It's a real premium airbrush. The inside of the cup is also nicely finished, and it has that Iwata taper at the bottom to direct the paint toward the nozzle. And one of the really great things about this PS771 is that you could usually pick it up for around half the price of the Iwata Micron. Here in the US, it's sold for around $200 to $220 US, but if you look around, you could find it cheaper. There's honestly no negatives to this airbrush. I absolutely love it. If you want a Micron and you don't want to spend that $400 or $500, this is a great alternative. But unlike the Micron, this only comes as one model with the large cup and the MAC valve. I would prefer to have this one with a smaller cup or a side feed, and definitely one without the MAC valve. Because when I'm painting with an extreme detail airbrush like this, I'm not using that much paint. I'm only using a few drops at a time. So for me, the cup is too large, and I just wish there was an option to buy this one with a smaller one, or better yet, a side feed. And the MAC valve is definitely a cool addition, but to me, it's just an extra part that I'm not going to use, and it's another possible point of failure. With the MAC valve though, you can adjust the airflow, giving yourself different volumes of paint coming out of the nozzle, but I'm always sitting right next to my compressor, and even though the regulator on the compressor works differently, by adjusting it, you're getting the same effect by a lower airspeed and a lower volume of paint coming through. And I'm aware that some people want to use the airbrush to stipple paint. You could do the same thing by dropping your PSI on your regulator to around 2 to 4. You'll get the same effect. And just like the Iwata Micron, this is not a great airbrush to start out with. You could still do it, but it's kind of difficult to use just because the nozzle's so small, and these could be kind of tough to use if you're not using a good airbrush paint and you haven't reduced it. I'll talk about this further when I get to the Iwata Micron because these two airbrushes are very, very similar. Regarding the trigger response rate, this airbrush is absolutely perfect. It's just like the two other Iwatas, exactly what you want for a detail airbrush. What's nice about this type of nozzle is that I'm actually holding this a bit farther back than I did the other airbrushes, and you can see that I'm getting a very small dot. And of course, that has to do with the design of the head system. Every airbrush is going to spray a fine line, but with a Micron, you could back up from the surface and still get a very acute spray pattern. So when you're trying to do things like add shading or gradients to very small areas, nothing comes close to the Micron. And when I'm starting and stopping the brush painting in letters, this airbrush is outstanding, phenomenal control. You could also see here just how thin these lines are. If I wanted lines this thin from any other airbrush, the needle would have to almost be touching the paper. On this one, I can back up a little bit. And I am holding the needle close to the surface, but the video is just kind of exaggerating that. It looks a bit closer here than it was in real life. And when painting fine lines, there's nothing easier than the Micron or the PS771. It's very forgiving for detail because it doesn't spray that much paint. So the PS771 by Creos or Mr. Hobby is my number 3 airbrush of all time. If you want a true extreme detail airbrush and you don't want to pay the price that it costs to buy a Micron, this airbrush, the PS771, is hands down the best choice. My number 2 airbrush is the best detail airbrush ever made. That's the Iwata Micron. When I'm painting any picture, this is the airbrush that I'm using 95% of the time. I own 2 models. This one right here is the Micron Takumi, and the other one is the custom Micron CMB. Both are the same airbrush with a 0.18mm needle and nozzle. The only difference is that this one here, the CMB, has the cup on top. It's a gravity-fed airbrush. And the other one, the custom Micron Takumi, has the cup on the side, but it's also gravity fed or gravity assisted since the paint is pulled from the bottom of the cup. The Takumi also has a trigger that's slightly closer to the nozzle than the CMB. And this airbrush is everything that I said I loved about the Sotar 2020, but better in nearly every way. You're so close to the nozzle when you're painting with this airbrush that it really feels like you're drawing with a technical pencil, and it just feels like you're holding it so close to the edge of the pencil where the graphite is. But what makes the Micron so special is that it's without question the most accurate and precise airbrush that I've ever used. Every single part of this airbrush is precisely made to fit the airbrush perfectly, and the head system, like I was talking about before, is the best ever made for a detail airbrush. It's one of the main reasons that no other airbrush sprays like the Micron. One thing that I find very interesting is that Iwata says that the head system is custom matched and tuned by hand. And one of the reasons for this is to meet their high rigorous standards, but the other is to maintain that each Micron will spray precisely over time, and that's very important. When you're paying a lot of money for an airbrush, you want it to last the rest of your life, and this is one of those airbrushes. Not only is the Micron the most accurate and precise airbrush, to me it also has one of the best trigger designs. The top of it here is squared and it comes down to a slight taper toward the front, and it just has these perfectly cut grooves along the top of it. It honestly offers the best grip that I've ever felt from any airbrush, and it's one that I'll paint with all day long. I'll never feel like my trigger finger is slipping off the airbrush, and it's very, very comfortable. This airbrush is just so good that it's the reason that it's the one that I used on every single painting and tutorial on this channel. It doesn't matter to me if I'm painting portraits or figure paintings, still lives, or landscapes. When I want detail and control with an airbrush, the Micron is the one that I'm always going to reach for. Moving along to the trigger response test, this airbrush is absolutely amazing. It's as good as it gets. And like I said a few times already, I'm very picky with this, but this is the way I want the trigger response to work on every airbrush. When you build up muscle memory, you don't really think about where you need to pull back on the trigger. You naturally understand, if I want this much paint, I'm going to pull back here. And like all Iwata airbrushes I've used, the Micron is always going to spray the same amount of paint at the same point. And that, of course, is as long as you're using a good quality paint and you have it reduced correctly. If you're looking to test the trigger response on one of your own airbrushes, this is the best way to do it. Write out any few words that you'd like, maybe your name, and make sure that you write it in print. Script or cursive where you're continually spraying the whole time is pretty easy to do with any airbrush, but try it when you're starting and stopping the paint over and over. And writing out small letters where you're starting and stopping is surprisingly difficult, and it's just a true test of how responsive an airbrush can be. And when you're painting fine lines like this is the best airbrush out there to do it. The only negative thing about the Iwata Micron is the price of it. Compared to other airbrushes, this one's very expensive. The list price for the CMB, the one on the top, is $600 US, and the list price for the custom Micron Takumi on the bottom is $650. So if we're just going by list price, the two airbrushes on the table here is going to set you back around $1,200. Fortunately, when you buy them at retail, they're sold a bit cheaper, but they're still expensive. I paid $500 for the Takumi, and then somewhere around $420 to $450 for the CMB. And compared to all the other airbrushes on the market, that's a lot of money. Is it worth the high price tag? That's up to you to decide. I can't answer it for you. But the Micron is so special and important to me that if I lost it and didn't have the money to buy a new one, I would sell every other airbrush that I own in order to buy a new one. Now, to some people, that may sound ridiculous, and I completely get it. I understand. But no other airbrush in the world is as precise and as accurate as a Micron, and it's one that I'll happily own and be painting with for the rest of my life. So that's it. The best detailed brush ever made, the Iwata Micron, at my number 2. My number 1 airbrush is an easy one. That's the Iwata Eclipse. This is an airbrush for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're buying your first one or if you've been painting for 30 years. If you want one airbrush that'll last the rest of your life, that could do everything and do it all well, it's the Iwata Eclipse. The one you're looking at right here is my Eclipse HPCS. This one is about 15 years old, and looking at it here, it almost looks brand new. I've painted with this airbrush thousands and thousands of hours, and it still paints like the day that I bought it. Iwata just did an amazing job with this chrome finish. It's one of the toughest from any airbrush brands. When you buy the airbrush brand new, the cup inside is polished very nicely. You could see here on mine that the chrome wore off. This happens to all airbrushes over the years. If you're painting with one for a long time, you'll see what I mean. And I assure you that this isn't any sort of rust or corrosion. The inside of the cup is still perfectly smooth. All it is some of the exposed brass. The Eclipse comes in a few different models. I also own the Eclipse Takumi, and this airbrush is the same thing as the HPCS, but like the Micron and the Micron Takumi, this one has a trigger that's a little bit closer to the nozzle, so it feels like you're getting closer to your work. And it also has that side feed gravity assisted cup, so you have more room for your trigger finger. They also make another gravity fed version, which has a smaller cup. They're all the same airbrushes. They spray the same. Like I said, there's a few differences in the design, but it's personal preference about which one you want. I personally prefer the HPCS, the one on top here with the gravity fed cup. And the main reason is that this is the airbrush that made me fall in love with painting with an airbrush. It was a slow transition for me. Over the years, I started using my oil paints less and less and started painting more with the airbrush with acrylics. So even though I'd prefer the HPCS over the Takumi, you can't go wrong with either one. The one thing that I really love about the Takumi version is that it has this trigger, and this is the exact same one that you see in the Micron. I think that this is the best and most comfortable trigger ever made. Same thing that I said when I was talking about the Iwata Micron Takumi. You also get the side feed option, which is very nice. The cup, it just is a lot easier to clean because you could take it off and just kind of flush it out. But still, if I had to pick one, it'll always be this one, the Iwata Eclipse HPCS. This model, just like the Takumi version, has a 0.35 millimeter needle and nozzle. That's kind of the sweet spot, like the Goldilocks zone. It's not too small and it's not too large. Compared to the Revolution, which was my number 4 airbrush, this one is just a little bit better for detail work. It also has this large nozzle inside that's floating, so easy to break down and clean. If you ever get a clog in there, it only takes a second or so to take it out. And the trigger control and response rate is the best you can get. This one is right up there with the Micron, extremely precise. Of course, the nozzle and the head assembly on the Eclipse are more suited toward, medium and wider paint applications. So if you're painting detail with this one, you are going to have to hold it closer to the surface than you would with the Micron. So this one is kind of similar to the Revolution. But the Eclipse absolutely has the edge over the Revolution for painting detail just because the nozzle is smaller. Writing out letters or words, starting and stopping the airbrush over and over, this one just almost feels like I'm writing with a pen. It's just so easy to do. It's starting and stopping the paint whenever I move the trigger back, and this is what I want to see for consistency. Same point every time where it starts and stops the paint. And again, if you want to test out your own airbrush's trigger response, this is one of the best ways of going about doing it. Just make sure that you're writing out letters in print, no cursive, and see how accurate that airbrush is when you start and stop the paint. The Eclipse is perfect. And if you're looking to paint fine lines or hairlines, this is one of the easiest airbrushes to do it with. When I was painting this copy of one of Rembrandt's self-portrait, I used the Eclipse for a lot of it, and I've used this airbrush on hundreds of paintings in the past. And it sprays outstanding detail. I'm adding in some shadows and some blending here around these buttons. It's just such a predictable airbrush. It's always doing what you want it to. And after over 15 years of use, you'd think that it wouldn't spray as well, but it sprays just as well as it did on day one. So you can kind of call this like a forever airbrush. You buy it once, it'll last you the rest of your life. And it does spray differently from a detail airbrush. This is a general use airbrush. But what I love about that is just how forgiving it is with different types of paints. You could use any airbrush paint right out of the bottle without any reducer, and it's going to spray it perfectly all day long. And that's why I put the Iwata Eclipse in the number 1 spot over the Micron. I don't think there's really such thing as a perfect airbrush, but if I had to say one airbrush is as close to perfect as you can get, it's this one, the Iwata Eclipse. So that's it for this one. It was a long video, but that's my top 10 airbrush recommendations. I think that these 10 airbrushes are the best airbrushes in the world today, and honestly, any one of these could be number 1. So let me know down below, what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Which airbrushes would you add? Which ones would you remove? Or better yet, tell me your top 3 or top 5 airbrushes down below, because I really look forward to reading those. And one last thing before I go, most of these airbrushes are expensive. If you want to start painting with an airbrush, please don't think that you need one of these to start out. When I started, I bought a cheap $10 or $15 one from eBay, and it worked great. Don't get me wrong, these 10 airbrushes are very nice to own, but they're not going to make you a better painter. Above all else, practice, patience, and observation are more important than any airbrush money can buy. And if you work on those things and find out that you enjoy painting, you want to invest in a better tool, these 10 airbrushes are my personal recommendations, and I hope that this list helps some of you out. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you back here next week.